Hold up. No, we can't run the intro yet because I've just noticed that, wait, 91% of you unsubscribed? Alright, come on. Let's try get that number to the mid-70s. The more of you that subscribe, the better my videos get. So what are you waiting for? Subscribe! It's time to return to Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud, the glorious New Zealand. Oh, hey Gandalf. No, yeah, I'm heading back to New Zealand. Yeah, a new video in New Zealand? No, I'm not late. I'm never late. I arrive precisely when I mean to. Alright, I'll see you soon. Yeah, I love you too. Alright, where were we? Yes. Auckland, New Zealand. The largest city in New Zealand, home to the Sydney Harbour Bridge from Wish. And most importantly, home to the national carrier Air New Zealand. Oh yeah, that's right. I bet you didn't see this coming. This is the beginning of a new series. And just like where the airport series began, we're back in the exact same place. This is the rich history of Air New Zealand. It's 1939 and British Airways and the New Zealand government come to an agreement that there needs to be a way of bringing Kiwis to Australia so that British Airways can take them to England. That and to this point international travel from New Zealand was hard to come by. So to that end, a new airline is established called Tasman Empire Airways Limited, or TEAL. Its job was to ferry passengers to and from Australia along with mail and cargo. That's where it all begins for Air New Zealand. And trust me when I say it gets a lot crazier. Wait a second, whoa. Am I supposed to believe that it gets crazier than flying boats? Oh yeah, I forgot to mention. Teal's fleet used the short S-30 flying boat. And the captain was Jim Hawkins. No, wait, that's Treasure Planet. Ah yes, this is the short S-30. Anyway, for 20 years, Teal flew these flying boats from Auckland to Sydney, Auckland to Wellington, and eventually Auckland to Fiji. Until 1960, when the flying boat was retired from the Teal fleet in favour of turboprop aircraft. 5 years later, in 1965, the New Zealand government bought the Australian government's stake in Teal, making the airline completely New Zealand owned. So, with that finally being the case, Teal was officially renamed, now becoming the pride and joy of New Zealand travel, Air New Zealand. At this stage, the airline still flew mostly international routes with minimal domestic operations. In 1965, Air New Zealand welcomed a number of brand new DC-8 aircraft into their fleet. These were modern, state-of-the-art aircraft that brought Air New Zealand into the upper echelon of air travel, especially in the oceanic region. Once they were welcomed into the fleet, they were immediately used for the new routes that were added to Air New Zealand's network, including trans-Pacific routes to Los Angeles and Honolulu. These two routes were a great way to introduce the world to Air New Zealand. Then, from 1970 to 1973, the airline integrated the new wider-body DC-10s into their fleet. These aircraft could go further, faster, and could carry more passengers as well. And it's probably worth noting that New Zealand don't allow snakes into their country, so Samuel L. Jackson has absolutely nothing to worry about. Now, up until 1978, the majority of New Zealand's domestic routes were mainly served by the National Airways Corporation and its little sister, Safe Air. But as we've seen up to this point, Air New Zealand always has grand plans to expand and modernise. So true to form, in 1978, Air New Zealand absorbed the National Airways Corporation and Safe Air, officially serving the majority of New Zealand, not only to the world, but domestically also. 3 years later, in 1981, Air New Zealand welcomed the Queen of the Skies into their fleet. 5 747-200s, each named after Maori ancestral canoes. These beasts flew a mix of routes that provided exposure to the airlines such as Los Angeles or London, as well as routes that had high traffic demand such as Auckland to Sydney or Auckland to Melbourne. This is when Air New Zealand began flying their now famous route of Auckland to Los Angeles onto London and then back to Auckland via Los Angeles. The flagship aircraft of Air New Zealand's fleet have always been the ones designated to fly this route. 4 years later in 1984, the 767-200ER joined their fleet following the retirement of the airline's fleet of Douglas DC-8s and DC-10s a year later. As you can see, keeping an airline modern and fresh requires constant equipment upgrades. To be successful, airlines have to be prepared to consistently provide their customers a top-tier product, which means maintaining a modern fleet of aircraft at all times. Okay, so to this point, we've had boat planes, lots of growth, no snakes, and a lot of work to stay modern. It's what happens from 1989 onwards that really takes Air New Zealand to a new level. It started with the privatisation of the airline, sold to Brearley Investments in 89, with partial stakes still being held by the New Zealand government and a consortium of the world's largest airlines. Which, to be honest, for the most part is a no-brainer. Being able to operate an airline through a commercial lens allows an airline to see a lot more ways to be profitable than if an airline is government operated. In 1990, similar to the USA, the New Zealand government deregulated their airline market. Oh, and I made a little video on that, the whole thing of which is linked in the top right. This prompted Air New Zealand to snag a 50% stake in Ansett in 1995. RIP Ansett. This meme will never die. Then in 1999, Air New Zealand became a member of the Star Alliance. So now you have the Sun, you have Alpha Centauri, and of course you have Air New Zealand. And then, amongst the impending doom that was expected to occur when the clocks ticked over to the year 2000, a battle was brewing. A battle between titans that would ultimately help completely change the oceanic airline landscape for the decades that followed. In the year 2000, our good friends at Ansett, may they rest in peace, were underperforming on a scale so bad that they were essentially on the edge of collapse. And it was at this point that Air New Zealand went into battle with a potential rival for the purchase of the collapsing airline. Singapore Airlines emerged from the billowing smoke above Ansett's headquarters and said, "Hey guys, come with me and set up a new home in Singapore under the Singapore name." And yes, it only took me 30 seconds to come up with that incredible joke. Air New Zealand quickly got the gloves out and said,
"If you want some, I'll give it you."
Singapore was understandably like, whoa there buddy, okay, we don't want any trouble. So Air New Zealand staked claim to the dying airline and tried to revive Ansett over the next year, but it became super costly as Ansett was basically bleeding money everywhere. So in September of 2001, Air New Zealand gave Ansett a proper funeral, and we all know what happened next. Trying to save Ansett came with some serious sacrifice, and ultimately Air New Zealand had to be bailed out by the New Zealand government. They agreed to save the national carrier under the proviso that they would take an 82% stake in the airline going forward. It was agreed upon, and in 2001, Air New Zealand underwent a rescue operation to the tune of $885 million. And interestingly, as part of this plan, the airline reconfigured its entire domestic network into a standard low-cost carrier format. And if you're wondering what that looks like, think of it like this. Say a low-cost carrier is Thanos, and say that instead of brutally destroying worlds to get the Infinity Gauntlet and stones, he purchases them using legal tender. Thanos can buy the Infinity Gauntlet as the base product alone, and then the low-cost carrier can offer him the Infinity Stones as additional features or products. So yeah, that's the best analogy I could think of. Anyway, after this took place in 2002, surprise, surprise, Mr. Stick My Fingers in Everyone's Pies Qantas offered the New Zealand government a juicy proposal to purchase a third of Air New Zealand, to which the New Zealand government turned down the offer. Then in 2003, just 2 years after the plan to rescue Air New Zealand had begun, the airline announced that they were back in net profit, reporting $165.7 million net profit for the year 2003. The plan had been successful, and with this, the airline wasted no time in doing what it's good at, which is innovating and upgrading. In late 2003, they welcomed the Airbus A320 to their fleet. They followed this up with a redesign and retrofit of many of their long-haul services. This featured a brand new business class, premium economy, and economy. Shortly after, Air New Zealand received its very first 777 and also placed an order for some 787 Dreamliners. Later, Boeing would announce Air New Zealand as a launch customer for the 787, meaning that the whole world was watching as their very first flight with the jet took to the sky. So it's now 2010. Air New Zealand have an established hub and spoke network operating out of their Auckland hub and feeding their international routes into their domestic network. Now they turn to the Australian domestic market with the question of how. How are they going to extend their reach to serve international passengers into an Australian domestic network? So they approach Virgin Blue, who are now Virgin Australia, and strike up a codeshare deal that allows Air New Zealand to put their name on a ticket that feeds into Australia. For instance, you can now fly Air New Zealand from Los Angeles to Adelaide even if Air New Zealand themselves don't fly into Adelaide. You'd go LA to Auckland, Auckland to Melbourne, and then hop on a Virgin flight from Melbourne to Adelaide. And to make sure that this was a long-term deal, Air New Zealand bought a 26% stake in Virgin Australia, later selling it in 2016. And 2 years later, the relationship had somewhat soured between the two airlines and the deal was scrapped. Then in 2011, Air New Zealand phased in the new 777-300ER, as well as their new Economy Sky Couch, which was a really cool couch that you could make out of a row of 3 seats on board the aircraft. And then in 2014, after significant delays, the time had finally come. Air New Zealand took delivery of their very first 787-9 Dreamliner. And with the exciting introduction of a new generation of aircraft came the decommissioning of another. In the same year, the Queen of the Skies was retired from the Air New Zealand fleet, with the final 747 being retired on September 14th, 2014. Then the last 737 was retired in September the next year, and then the 767s in March of 2017. And this is why when you think Air New Zealand, you're likely to think modern fleet, because they keep it all fresh and up to date constantly. So today, Air New Zealand's fleet comprises of A320, 777, 787, ATR 72 and Q300 aircraft. The New Zealand government owns a 53% stake of the airline, and the airline is a member of the Star Alliance group. Their hub of operations is in Auckland, New Zealand, as well as a small domestic hub for its ATR 72s and Q300s in Christchurch. Their aircraft sport a variety of liveries that all incorporate the silver fern in a black and white colour scheme combo. Air New Zealand serves 20 domestic destinations and 30 international destinations in 18 countries and territories across Asia, North America and Oceania. Over the course of its existence, the airline has taken delivery of over 1,600 aircraft. Their service is considered to be amongst the best in the world. Their marketing is absolutely fantastic. It has that classic New Zealand humour that works so well in promoting their products. And don't even get me started on the in-flight safety videos.
If there's a mishap during takeoff or landing, brace yourself on the seat in front of you. I myself prefer the more compact method. Put your hands on your head, your elbows on either side of your legs, and your feet flat on the floor.
Air New Zealand is also doing its part toward reducing carbon emissions and creating a sustainable aviation industry. As part of the Sustainable Aviation Fuels Alliance of Australia and New Zealand, Air New Zealand are direct participants in a development program designed to create jet fuel from sustainable fuel crops. Basically, they're going to try out new fuels that are now more environmentally responsible. They're also doing their part to fly zero emissions flights. Now, while you may not be able to greatly reduce the emissions caused by fuel burn, you can cancel out most of the effects by making environmental savings in other areas. Fully biodegradable in-flight products, sustainably produced seating and interior cabins from recycled products, and so on. I mean, there's a lot more that Air New Zealand are doing to help the environment, but honestly, I'd need an entire video to cover it all. Generally, a very environmentally responsible airline. And that's it. Everything that you need to know about Air New Zealand from start to finish. Thanks for watching. So what did you think of this new type of video? Like this video if you think I should keep it going. Did I miss out anything in this video? Leave a comment down below. As always, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.